Yeah. Hello. My name is Cory Zibell. I'm a technology lead for a company called Digital Surgeons. I'll get into what that is in a second because I know it's less recognizable than VMware. If you want to contact me or DS anywhere across social media, you can do so. That's my handle pretty much everywhere, and same for Digital Surgeons. Digital Surgeons is a digital demand consultancy. I got paid to say that. Essentially what that means is we're a marketing agency that focuses on business KPI. We work with some big name clients, but rather than being pure application developers, many of our focuses are strategy based. A little history, Digital Surgeons is about 10 years old. We sort of are a very, very small engineering team, as you can tell, so less than 10 engineers. We have 9. Goldman Sachs has 9,000. Little difference. So essentially, there are 40 employees, and we have very quick turnaround times in our work because most of our clients are working in a very short timeline with a marketing budget and KPIs attached to it. So it's very different from, say, enterprise application development. Cool. A little history of the Digital Surgeons DevOps process and history. Back in the day, there was really no rigor. It was sometimes we have code being tracked, sometimes not. Rsync stuff, this is all before I started. In 2014, we started switching all of our code to Beanstalk, and Beanstalk basically allowed us to finally start tracking stuff instead of it just being willy-nilly, whatever was going on. Started to use deploy.io, essentially as our kind of CI. It worked sometimes, it didn't work others. 2015, the reckoning. Essentially, we started switching everything to this drone CI system that we had sort of custom installed, and nobody at the agency knew Go, so it was very just kind of follow tutorials and hope we know what we're doing. So that worked sort of to an extent. The feature set was great, but it was hard for us to maintain. And then early 2016, we moved everything to GitLab, so all of our code bases tracked in repositories properly. Everything in a CI system. And slowly but surely, as we were earlier adopters, GitLab has grown and we've grown as well and used more and more of their tools. Yeah, so like I said, less than 10 engineers. In terms of number of deployments and commits, usually around over 100 a day. Because of the wide variety of clients we have in code bases, we have over 300 code bases currently in our Git repository set up through GitLab. Cool. So our current setup in terms of infrastructure is basically we're using GitLab Cloud. We don't have the time nor effort that we can put into hosting our own GitLab and sort of managing that. So on GitLab Cloud, what we do have is our custom CI runners. So those are containerized and basically running CoreOS and doing the proper container deployments. And then we have a high-powered development server on DigitalOcean that essentially runs the majority of our development projects. And then, as you can see, the individual production instances are based on client need, and I'll get into what that means. Cool. So for production environments, you can sort of see on the screen, this is just a search in our sort of password manager. So in terms of where our production instances are, they're all over the place because sometimes clients come to us and we don't have the ability to take over their production instances. Sometimes they are just legacy and we have to get something out the door. And sometimes they're not willing to pay for us to move that stuff over. So Cloudways, DigitalOcean, Rackspace, AWS, a lot of our sites use Cloudflare as well. And then we have some Google cloud products as well that we utilize. Cool, yeah, so if you go on our development server right now, go into our main sites folder, you'll see 566 folders, and those are all various code bases that are sort of doing different things, but it means that there's a lot for us to track, a lot for us to take care of. So how do we do it? So a long time ago, about 2 years ago, I built a tool called Exalt. Exalt is a Node.js project that we use that sort of automates our initial Git setups, and it's very similar to kind of the new GitLab automated CI that they demonstrated, the auto Devops. It's just very specific to our needs, but it's open source. You can go to our source code and check it out. It does a whole bunch of things. I'll show you a little like walkthrough of what that looks like. Cool. Yeah, so essentially it's a Node.js app. You can see the text is kind of small, sorry about that, but it's doing a couple different things. It's basically asking a new developer, someone who's not familiar with DevOps, what a project should be called. It automatically slugifies the project, checks if it's already set up on GitLab, if it's a repo or not, and then it does the work to generate SSL keys, SSH keys, sort of create all these variables that we need for our deployments to work. And that all happens asynchronously. So since it's built in Node, it's not like going through a synchronous task. It's using a combination of the GitLab API in addition to some SSH tasks that it runs. Oh, there you go. Come on. Cool. Yeah, so Eddie demonstrated a lot of this stuff before in terms of pipelines. A feature that we take advantage of is we have a singular GitLab config. So every project obviously has its own GitLab ci.yaml, but we have a single code base. And what happens in this code base is there's a whole bunch of individual files that get included. And I'm going to get into what these files look like. But essentially, all of the deterministic steps in our build process are passed through as variables. So what that means is essentially whether or not something should follow through a front-end build. If something's not going to use Webpack as an example, then we can turn that off at the variable level. And then additionally, the actual pathways, the SSH keys, all the kind of environment variables that you would expect project to project, those are all variables in GitLab. I keep losing this thing. Cool. Yeah, so one of the things we include is feature branches, and feature branches are very similar to kind of that Kubernetes deploy setup that you saw before, just more down to earth. So essentially, we use something called Git Flow as a Git branching model. I'm going to jump into that a little later, but basically every feature branch deploys to a new path, and it allows us to immediately essentially pass a environment URL over to a client. So it's really important that our clients are getting eyes on the work that we're doing so we can quickly sort of make those deployments happen, have their eyes on it before anything goes to production. So you can see here, I highlighted just some of the variables as an example. So we pull in a ton of variables. Some of them are automatically set up. GitLab is spitting out what the commit message is, so we're checking against if we should skip builds. Things like server paths, essentially what the domains are that we consider to be these features, and then whether or not we're enabling sort of this feature build system in this one repo. Here you can see the teardown, so it's pretty simple, but essentially what this is doing is just removing that environment, that feature, so that as soon as we're done with it, it's no longer taking up space on our environments. So same thing, just more variables being passed in so that we know exactly what's being removed specifically from our deploy environment here. Here is our composer build setup. So a lot of the projects we do are Laravel based or PHP based. So a lot of our work revolves around composer builds in terms of backend. So here you can kind of see we'll include this if the project is specifically a Laravel project, and it's important to have this step, but it means that we don't have to have this on all of our projects. It's all centralized, and we can just pass in these variables to this individual repo. Same thing, more variables here. Front end, very similar, same type of thing. One thing that we do on front end is we have different projects rely on different node versions for the front end build. And what that means essentially is that the version of NPM that comes with that specific Docker instance is different. And so the easiest way to get around that is essentially to upgrade NPM. And the reason that we do that is we want to use NPM CI as opposed to NPM install so that we're maintaining versions across this, because otherwise everything would break. More variables. Cool, so the majority of our client projects that are public facing, we try and use Cloudflare for caching, but on production deployments, we don't want to have to manually do that. So essentially, we fire off an API request to Cloudflare, and once again, all those variables are stored in that specific repo, so we don't have to worry about changing them specifically here. And then the last thing that we do that's pretty interesting, you can see the stages there where it says build, deploy, and test. Earlier today, you heard a lot about smoke testing. Obviously, we do unit testing when we can, but if a client comes to us and says, we have 2 weeks turnaround, we need to get this campaign out the door kind of thing, we still need to test the most business and mission critical pieces of the application. And the only way to do that is to have something deployed that we can work with. So what we do is we actually deploy to our dev server, and then we test after that. So we're switching the stages up, and then we run Cypress. And so if you haven't heard of Cypress, Cypress is essentially headless testing. So basically, Google Chrome is essentially running inside this instance, running through tests, firing off a form. Did the form respond correctly? Does this page include this text? That sort of thing. And then it generates these artifacts and will tell us if it was successful. The good thing about those artifacts as well is they're both videos and screenshots of essentially what's happening. So we can look at that Cypress testing and then see if something went wrong, exactly what happened, like with a video recording of the application. Yep, so deployments are pretty simple. You saw this before, so this is a YAML template for deployment. So basically, we're just essentially pulling out the different things that are important for us, private keys and the like. We verify known hosts that there's no SSH miscollision or somebody man in the middles. And then you can just see the artifacts of the Cypress environment path so that we can test against that once it's deployed. So here's an example of just basically taking that template, that .deploy, extending it, adding some more conditionals, and then essentially utilizing that to deploy straight to our production. So like I said, a lot of variables. So this would be an example of one of our projects in GitLab. All these variables are configured to change the deployments in some way, essentially making it so that we only have a singular set of GitLab CI configs when possible, and everything is controlled through these variables. Yeah, so I mentioned Git Flow. Semver is pretty obvious, so semantic versioning, but what's important here is a branching model that makes sense across all of our projects. And so why that's important is essentially any developer should immediately understand how our branches are set up. So you can see as a clean example visualized here, everything's set up to be either a feature branch or a release or a hotfix. And then the versioning is based on Semver there. Yeah, so I mentioned this Cypress thing. So it allows us to run these tests independently of the deploy. It's headless. It runs in our CI, and it basically allows us to verify these mission critical sort of pieces of the application. Cool. Yeah, so all in all, small team with our automation, our building, our testing and deploying all handled by GitLab. We save hundreds of hours a week. It's hard for me to even come up with the amount of time that we save doing that. And then QA, cool. Yeah, anybody have any questions? Word. Cool, thanks everyone.